Already this year, they've had hearings on prescription drugs, smart home technology, hospitals, and mobile app stores. They've helped ignite a national conversation on antitrust and a best-selling book. And in industry after industry, they've identified opportunities to make markets more competitive and transparent. Senator Grassley, Senator Klobuchar, and I serve on the Committee on Agriculture as well. We represent 3 states in the Midwest where our farmers and ranchers play a big role. Over the past century, our agriculture sector has served as a foundation of the most productive and efficient food supply on earth. That is the genius of American innovation. Despite droughts, floods, pandemics, and other disruptions, we continue to produce an abundance of food and not only feed our people, but we feed the world. Yet the COVID-19 pandemic, where there have been problems with supplies, wasted crops, and shifts in consumer spending, have shown a bright light on the cracks in our food system that need to be addressed. We'll hear today about how the pricing system in livestock must be structured to encourage quality and efficiency, but also fair, transparent, and competitive. We must support food producers large and small, start by addressing the barriers that prevent small farmers and livestock producers from thriving in the marketplace. We'll learn about the dangers of consolidation and market concentration, especially in the beef processing industry, where just 4 companies control about 80% of the national market. There'll be discussions about keeping business costs down, but those efforts must also preserve and strengthen a safe environment and livable wages for workers. I actually worked in a meat packing plant. I won't give you, it's a heartbreaking story. I won't give you that story again. I did once, that's enough. I'll just tell you that I understand a little bit about this process from personal experience. Senator Schaben, the chair of the Ag Committee, has been a leader in this area. She introduced the Food Supply Protection Act, which I co-sponsored, authorizing financial assistance to help expand capacity at smaller regional levels. Already we've made some progress in expanding support for these farmers and producers. The December COVID package and the American Rescue Plan included funding. Secretary Vilsack has announced the USDA plans to invest $4 billion into our food supply chain, which will include millions of dollars in grants to develop and expand meat processing. There's more to do. We had a hearing yesterday on ransomware. We all know that one of the major suppliers was hit by the ransomware attack. That attack briefly forced JBS to shut down all of its beef plants in the United States. They account for nearly 1/4 of America's entire beef supply. The shutdown caused an immediate jump in the price of wholesale beef, which sent cattle futures swinging. This episode demonstrated the vulnerability that our food suppliers have when it comes to cyber attacks. We have to take it seriously. We need to make sure that American innovation has ensured that fundamentals of our food supply remain strong, but there's still too many Americans for whom our food supply is not working. Today we'll have an honest conversation on addressing these shortcomings. I want to turn to Senator Grassley for his opening remarks, and then to Senator Klobuchar and Senator Lee.
Well, since you didn't remind us about your years at the packing plant, I won't remind people about my 6 years at the Rath Packing Company in Waterloo, Iowa.
Well, people are grateful to both of us.
Okay. First of all, I thank Chairman Durbin and Antitrust Subcommittee Chairman Klobuchar for accommodating my request to have this hearing. This is an area that I've been concerned about for a long time, and now many other senators are also hearing concerns from their constituents. So today's hearing will focus on competition matters within the meat supply chain, particularly in regard to beef. I'm pleased that we have 2 Iowans here with us as witnesses today and look forward to their testimony. I thank all of our witnesses for coming and sharing their expertise with us. Family farmers who feed cattle are the lifeline of rural communities across Iowa, and they're currently on life support. For more than 2 decades, I've expressed strong reservations about consolidation and concerns about competition in agriculture. My first legislation on this subject was introduced in 2003. Today, only 4 packers, JBS, Tyson's, Cargill, and National Beef, control more than 80% of the cattle market. These companies hold a tremendous amount of market power. Independent cattle producers in Iowa and across the country deserve a free and fair market. The amount of cattle traded on a cash market in the early 2000s were more than 50%, but today it has dropped to less than 20%. All other cattle contracts use the cash market as base price for their negotiations, but not true of beef. I've heard from many Iowa cattlemen, like one of our witnesses today, John Schaben, who fought to keep auction markets open and functioning as close to normal during the pandemic because they're so vital to price discovery in the cattle industry. My home state has 60% cash trade, and the Iowa cattle producers are frustrated that they're shouldering this burden of price discovery. I've also heard that alternative marketing agreements like formulas offer advantages to some producers. However, these contracts have no price transparency. Captive supply is unfair and anti-competitive when packers use these types of arrangements to fill their needs, and small producers can't get a bid for their fed cattle. Many of us believe that packers have so much power that they unfairly leverage it against other players in the market and to the detriment of the consumer. Although I have many concerns with this industry, I would like to recognize and commend the employees of these packing plants around the country during the pandemic who continue to work so hard to keep food on Americans' plates. The pandemic has shed light on many problems with the Packers and Stockyards division and its inability to preserve our nation's beef supply chain. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for every $1 Americans spend on food, only 14 3/10 cents go to the farmers. Meanwhile, the retail price of beef for consumers has increased and remains high. I want to make it clear that I'm not upset about paying more for beef. What I'm upset about farmers not getting paid for the work they do in the sense of not having profit. As the first link in our food supply chain, farmers and ranchers assume incredible risks for each crop and each animal raised, but their livelihoods depend on receiving a fair price. Even before the pandemic, farmers and ranchers witnessed the price of their cattle fall while the price of boxed beef from the processor increased. The market's clearly not working fairly when demand is extraordinarily strong and supply at the same time is strong. But the packers are making record profits and ranchers are losing money. That's why I believe it's important that the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Justice, and the Federal Trade Commission be engaged and aggressive in policing anti-competitive activity. A year ago, last March, I wrote to Attorney General Barr and Secretary Perdue, who was secretary at that time, calling for an investigation about the possible illegal practices in the cattle industry. I know that the Justice Department issued civil investigative demands in May 2020, but I'm disappointed that we're not yet able to learn anything about this investigation. I currently have legislation pending to address the concerns of some of my colleagues, and I have about cash trade in the cattle market. I also have a bill with Senator Tester to create special investigator for competitive matters within USDA's Packers and Stockyards division to address anti-competitive practices and enforce our competition laws. Most recently, I was pleased to hear the Biden administration and Secretary Vilsack announcement about restoring the Packers and Stockyards Act to fight unfair practices and rebuild the competitive playing field for farmers and ranchers. So I do look forward to today's hearing to beef up competition in our beef supply chain.
Beef up competition. Right. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Chairman Durbin. Senator Grassley, thank you for holding this hearing. As many of you know, Senator Lee and I have been conducting, as mentioned by the chairman, a series of hearings in our subcommittee examining the broad scope of America's monopoly problem. And today, we are glad to explore the competition issues in the food supply chain. The COVID-19 pandemic painfully exposed some of the inherent risks to our food supply chain, resulting from high levels of industry consolidation. As the spread of the virus forced closures at major meat packing facilities, for example, livestock producers were left with no willing buyers for their livestock. And due to consolidation in the meat processing industry, there weren't really alternatives. The result for consumers was inflated retail prices for beef and pork products, and in some areas, empty meat cases. Of course, COVID-19 has had devastating effects on many industries, but in the meat industry, those effects were exacerbated by the lack of competition up and down the supply chain. The takeaway message should be clear. A concentrated food supply chain is a vulnerable food supply chain. And although meat products are back in supermarket meat cases and major meatpacking facilities have resumed operation, the longstanding structural problems with our meat supply chain remain. 4 companies, as noted by my colleagues, control more than 80% of beef processing. 4 companies control 70% of pork processing. That is why livestock producers are as concerned as ever about market consolidation and market power in the meat supply chain. This is especially true for independent livestock producers who have seen their margins dwindle as they are forced to sell at depressed prices and on unfavorable terms. But we cannot just look at meat processors in isolation. Further down the supply chain, there are concerns about large retailers exerting buyer power to suppress product pricing from meat suppliers, putting pressure on wholesalers, packers, and livestock producers. According to the Open Markets Institute, approximately 65% of grocery sales are controlled by the top 4 grocery companies nationwide, and that percentage can be much higher in local markets. Such retailer buyer power risks compromising independent retailers' access to meat supply and other supplies during times of market disruption and limits consumers' potential retail choices. It also risks harming livestock producers, food production workers, and the rural communities in which they live and work, as large national retailers capture a larger share of what consumers spend on products. We are focused on meat in this hearing, but it is important to point out that we have excessive consolidation and competition problems throughout our food supply chain. In addition to meat processing and retailing, we have seen a handful of large companies dominating food-related markets, such as corn and soybean seeds, fertilizer, pest control, farm equipment, food distribution, and food manufacturing. According to the American Antitrust Institute, only a small fraction of the 1,300 mergers in the food processing, manufacturing, and distribution sectors were challenged by the government, and the rate of agency second requests for mergers in these sectors have been steadily declining. So the meat issue is part of a larger problem. Monopoly and monopsony power exist up and down the food supply chain. If you look at history, at the Granger's movement fight against monopolies after the Civil War, competition issues in the farm and food economy are a big part of why we have antitrust laws in the first place. In fact, it was Senator Grassley's home state. He wasn't there after the Civil War. Okay. It was Senator Grassley's home state, Iowa, that passed the first state antitrust law in 1888. In large part to address concerns from farmers and livestock producers. And yet here we are today still talking about the serious competition problems in our food supply chain. The Antitrust Division's ongoing prosecution against criminal price fixing in the poultry industry and its investigation into potential anti-competitive practices in the highly concentrated beef processing industry are clear signs that consolidation in these markets is causing harm. As chair of the Senate Competition Policy Subcommittee, I've been pushing for greater antitrust enforcement across the board. And that's why the bill Senator Grassley and I have, the Merger Filing Fee Modernization Act, so important. Our enforcers need the resources. I thank this committee for passing it through, and it passed the Senate and is now awaiting action in the House. Secondly, the Competition Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act would make sweeping changes. Many others on both sides of the aisle have been working on this issue. So to me, this is the tip of the iceberg, but we are very pleased to have this hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The vitality and stability of our food supply is of concern to all Americans. and the meat processing industry is particularly important to people in my home state of Utah. During the height of the pandemic, meat packing plants either operated under significantly reduced processing capacity or in many cases closed entirely. The decreased supply of meat products led to increased prices for consumers and in some areas to a complete unavailability of certain meats, despite a backup of livestock among many growers. In this really difficult circumstance, we found that hog farmers were being forced to euthanize perfectly good hogs because they were quickly outgrowing the size restrictions of the pork processing plants. It's sickening that these farmers had to destroy perfectly good food while out-of-work Americans were paying higher prices for meat or going without meat altogether. Today, we're focused on the dynamics of our beef supply chain. Fortunately, cattle don't outgrow the processing plant quite as quickly and easily as hogs do. But we're still seeing significant impacts of processing reductions on the cattle industry. The numbers tell an interesting story. Beef prices are up, and packers are making strong profits. But many of our cattle producers are operating at negative margins, and some are quitting the business altogether. If these are natural glitches in the market caused by the pandemic itself, then the market should eventually right itself. However, if the market doesn't self-correct, we have to sort out the problem, whether it's bad actors, a lack of transparency, over-regulation, or over-consolidation, and do whatever it is that we can to fix it. First, we have to ensure that the market is operating freely and fairly, that there's no anti-competitive behavior forcing new entrants or the feeders who support them out of the market. If we find anti-competitive behavior, we need to use every legitimate means to stop it. Price discovery and transparency will go a long way toward ensuring a free and a fair market. The cash market determines the base price for cattle, which is then used for every other form of price determination. However, today, at most 20% of cattle are sold on the cash market, and that number is down from about 50 or 60% just 15 years ago. This lack of price transparency makes it difficult to discern whether these pricing dynamics are disrupting the balance of negotiating power or whether they're creating a negative feedback loop suppressing all cattle prices. Fairness in the market is impacted by packer consolidation. Where there's lack of competition, packers can dictate the rate of available supply. We need to ask why chain speeds are down. Is it due to lingering COVID restrictions? Is production below capacity because packers simply can't get employees to come back post-pandemic in light of unemployment insurance factors or other government-precipitated conditions? Is it low because the packers, not facing genuine competition in many, many areas of the country, recognize the benefits that flow to them if supply simply remains suppressed? We must also ask why this market is so concentrated. If we've approved too many mergers and made regulations so burdensome that massive, wide-scale consolidation is unavoidable, then we can't be surprised when we end up with these regional monopsonies. Congress is not, and should not be, responsible for structuring industries. Many of the proposed solutions I've seen, mostly mandating government intervention in the market, would ultimately increase the price of beef, especially the price of beef for the end consumer. Increasing the cost for the packer won't bless the producer, and it certainly will harm the consumer. What we should do is look for opportunities to free up the free market. Let's lift stifling federal regulations, which I believe are responsible for a lot of the problems we see in this industry. That's why I'm a proud sponsor of something called the Prime Act, which would lift many of the onerous federal mandates on small meat packers, allowing them to sell their meat cuts as allowed by state law. Let's enforce antitrust law, and if and when violations occur, then let's get out of the way and allow these businesses to thrive. You see, sometimes when we see a lack of competition, there's collusion among industry. Sometimes when we see a lack of competition, it's government that's driving that lack of competition. This is one of those places, I believe.
Thank you very much, Senator Lee. Now we're going to introduce the witnesses. I believe Senator Grassley has two witnesses to introduce.
I do have two witnesses from my state. John Schaben was not even born when his dad was Democratic leader of the state Senate, and I served with him in the legislature at that particular time. He's from Dunlap, Iowa. His wife, Julie, they have 4 children, 2 actively engaged in agriculture. John graduated from Iowa State University with a degree in animal science, is also a graduate of the Missouri Auction School. He was a 2003 world champion livestock auctioneer. John co-owns and operates the Dunlap Livestock Auction and the West Point Livestock with his brothers. They're the second generation to run the Dunlap Livestock, which was started by his parents in the 1950s. John also operates a commercial cow-calf herd. John has been a member of the Iowa Cattlemen's Association since the 1980s and currently serves on the Beef Product Labeling Task Force. Shane Miller was born and raised in Ruthven, Iowa, currently resides in Sioux City, Iowa. He's a graduate of Westmar College with a bachelor's degree in accounting and finance. He is the group president of Fresh Meats at Tyson's Food and is responsible for all beef and pork operations and fresh meat sales. In his role leading Fresh Meats, Shane has oversight of 35,000 Tyson team members and 25 manufacturing facilities. Working for 3 decades in the meat industry, he's held various roles at Tyson's, including numerous management and office level positions. So we welcome both of you and thank you for testifying.
Okay, very good. Did you want to add anything, Senator Cotton? And then Senator Sass has something.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. I just want to take a minute to recognize and welcome Shane Miller as well. He may be an Iowan, but we also like to claim him here since he's representing Tyson, which is an Arkansas company. Shane's been working in beef for 3 decades, first with Iowa Beef Processors before he joined the Tyson Food family, and as group president of the fresh meat section, he brings excellent expertise on the beef supply. I also want to take a moment to recognize those in our food supply chain who kept things running during the Wuhan coronavirus pandemic over the last 18 months. Our cattle ranchers and meat packers made sure that Americans had beef on the table. We have an amazing food supply chain in the United States, and that's because of hardworking farmers and ranchers in my state and many other states, along with companies like Tyson, that ensure those products get to our tables in a safe and affordable way. So I'm glad to welcome Shane Miller here today, and I look forward to hearing what he and all the other witnesses have to say.
Senator Sass?
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. This is obviously a critically important hearing. Thank you for hosting it. There are a number of questions that we on this dais have for the witnesses, and we're voting in other committees and on the floor right now. So if I could just ask unanimous consent, I want to introduce a statement from the Nebraska Cattlemen to the record, but I look forward to returning later in the hearing as well.
Excellent. Thank you. It'll be on the record. I'm going to finish introducing the witnesses now. Next up, Tim Schulpepper. He is the president of the Fed Beef Division at JBS USA, where he oversees JBS's feedlot fat and beef cattle unit. He has held that position since 2017, and he has more than 35 years of experience in the protein industry. David Smith. David is the president and CEO of Associated Wholesalers Grocers, Inc., a position he has held since 2015. AWG is a cooperative wholesaler that supplies around 3,100 grocery stores in 28 states. He has more than 3 decades of experience in the food industry. Rob Larue. Rob, who I know personally, is the president of the National Farmers Union, where he represents the approximately 200,000 farmer and rancher members of the National Farmers Union. Previously, he spent more than 22 years working in Congress and for the USDA. Last but not least, George Slover. George is the Senior Policy Counsel for Consumer Reports. He formerly worked for the House Judiciary Committee and the Department of Justice, and he is an expert on competition issues. After we swear in the witnesses, each witness will have 5 minutes to make an opening statement, and then we will turn to Senator's questions with 5-minute rounds. Could all the witnesses please stand, including the ones at home, to be sworn in? Do you affirm that the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Schaben, why don't you proceed with your statement?
Thank you very much, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the nation's independent cattle producers. As I said before, my name is John Schaben. I'm from Dunlap, Iowa, and my family operates a livestock auction business in not only Dunlap, Iowa, but West Point, Nebraska. We do think that livestock auctions are the greatest form of price discovery out there, as we need competition in our marketplace every day for those to function. I'm also a cow-calf producer. My family runs a backgrounding operation, and we feed out some steers and heifers annually. Today, I'm here to represent the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, which is headquartered in Ames, Iowa, in a grassroots organization representing nearly 8,000 cattle producers and industry affiliates. My hope is that this testimony and this hearing will encourage meaningful change to benefit all independent cattle producers. Cattle producers in Iowa and across the nation have expressed grave concern regarding the severe lack of cash trade, limited price discovery, and an imbalance in leverage between those who raise cattle and those who process them into the beef we consume. With an increasing prevalence of extreme market shifts and limited ability of producers to mitigate market risk in the cattle industry, it is imperative that we uplift the concerns of those in the production sector for this Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. Simply put, the beef supply chain begins with and relies upon thousands of dedicated independent cattle producers. I think in this committee hearing, I'm gonna go off text here just a minute. I think if we don't hear it here, we've heard it all the way up to date about these black swan events that have affected our industry over the last couple years. I hear about that they're responsible for why we're probably here today, and I just don't think, in the context of what they are, that's actually factual. I think the black swan events were a great example of what's broken about the marketing chain in live cattle, and they show the some of the things that need to be changed within this industry. So I think it's unfair to say that they're causing the problems that we have, which is this great big discrepancy between what our cattle are worth live when we sell them and what they end up worth as retail beef. A couple things I think back that up. In 2015, 51.5% of the consumer dollars spent on beef returned to producers. In 2020, that figure dropped to 37%. That's been a steady decline from what the producers are getting from what the retail dollar is. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're here to address that. Most recently, we see live values of cattle in the $1,500 to $1,700 range, but the carcass values of when they're processed in the $2,500 to $2,700 range, $1,000 difference between what the producers are getting for and what the end product becomes out. If we process more than 500,000 cattle a week in the fed cattle industry, in my simple math, that's 500 million a week that is eroded out of our rural economy. As we all look for ways to stimulate rural economy, it looks if we can bring a functioning cattle market back and bring that spread narrowed down, that's the way we can infuse more cash into our rural sector. From the Iowa Cattlemen standpoint, first and foremost, we ask that the Department of Justice provides an update regarding their antitrust investigation into the major beef packers. Senate Bills 949 and 543 need prioritized, and in addition, Senate Bill 2036, we applaud that to bring up the anti-competitive practices in the meat industry. In conclusion, cattle producers work hard to manage inputs, mitigate risk, and raise cattle that ultimately provide the high-quality beef demanded by meat packers, retailers, and consumers. The greatest fear of independent cattle producers is to lose their livelihoods for the sake of meat packing efficiency, an example, vertical integration. We've witnessed vertical integration firsthand with the swine and poultry industries, so we know what that path is like. The combination of limited competition, captive supply, and formula contracting has not only suppressed live cattle prices, practices, but has placed a tremendous financial burden on the shoulders of cattle producers. This is and will continue to lead to the decline of independent cattle producers in Iowa and across the country. The lifeblood of our rural communities is agriculture. Independent cattle producers support their local communities. They are the best possible caretakers of the land and the natural resources in America. We must do all we can to ensure they survive to continue providing high-quality, sustainably produced, and nutritious beef for consumers. Cattle producers deserve a level playing field. We're asking for a transparent, competitive marketplace to strengthen the beef supply chain. Failure to take swift action leaves Congress, USD, and the DOJ culpable for the countless cattle producers that will inevitably be starved out of the industry. Since 1978, Iowa's lost more than 45,000 family farms that sold cattle. How many more family farmers and ranchers do we need to lose before we recognize the negative impacts of the highly concentrated meatpacking industry on our beef supply chain and our rural communities? Thank you, and I'll welcome any questions.
Very good. Thank you. That was quite fast. I have a feeling you're an auctioneer on this side. We sometimes have bills read into the record. We may contact you. Next, Mr. Larue.
All righty, thanks so much. Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee, thank you for the invitation to testify this afternoon. I am Rob Larue, and I serve as president of National Farmers Union. Our organization works to ensure that family farmers and their communities are respected, valued, and enjoy economic prosperity and social justice. Founded in 1902, Farmers Union is made up of 200,000 farm families across the country. Our organization was started in part to help to restore and enhance competition in agriculture. While there are many challenges that face our members, having a fair marketplace remains a central issue for Farmers Union and for the economy as a whole. As President Biden said recently, capitalism without competition isn't capitalism, it's exploitation. Family farmers and ranchers and our communities are worse off because of the domination and market manipulation by multinational meat companies like those represented here today. The four largest companies in each sector of the meat industry have grown dramatically in the last few decades. Today, as has been mentioned, those companies control 85% of beef packing, 70% of pork processing, and 54% of broiler chicken processing. In beef, there's been a shift toward alternative marketing agreements and a thinning cash or spot market, which gives packers even greater control over the cattle supply. The concentrated markets also increase the opportunity for manipulation, and there's been a raft of price-fixing litigation against processors. Allegations have touched all three major meat sectors, cattle, hogs, and broiler chickens, and both of the corporations represented here today are among the companies that have paid fines or settled lawsuits for price fixing. The danger of an uncompetitive livestock market is not only economic, it is also felt in food security. This was clear in the first few months of the pandemic. Closures or slowdowns at meatpacking plants resulted in lost markets for farmers, endangered our food supply and the health of workers, and led to higher prices for consumers. Soon after, family farmers and ranchers endured historic spreads between live animal prices and retail meat prices. We saw similar issues with the fire at Tyson's Holcomb plant in 2019 and the cyber attack against JBS earlier this year. These corporations are too big, and when they fail or take advantage of their power, we all suffer. We must learn from this experience. Greater emphasis must be placed on resilience in the food supply, and unbridled corporate power must be checked. Farmers Union is not the only producer organization that has joined in the call for swift and meaningful reform. Despite the very independent nature, lots of times, of groups that represent ranchers, the vast majority of these groups got together and agreed on what needed to be done. With that in mind, the time for action is now. Fortunately, there are steps that Congress, this committee, and the administration can take to support a food supply chain that is competitive and resilient. These reforms can be investments and incentives, but must also include regulatory and enforcement actions. First, USDA can support the Packers and Stockyards Act by implementing rules that ensure specific protections for family farmers and ranchers. This idea features heavily in President Biden's recent executive order on competition and is a monumental step forward. Second, Congress and USDA can enact reforms to price reporting and labeling that will provide accurate, reliable, and timely information. This should include a minimum level of cash transactions, contract libraries, and the reauthorization of mandatory price reporting. Third, there needs to be greater investment in local and regional marketing and processing options. USDA has already committed $500 million from the American Rescue Plan to help in this effort, and more will be needed. And fourth, we need to better scrutinize mergers with legislation like Senator Klobuchar's Competition and Antitrust Law Enforcement Reform Act. Furthermore, it is time to push for more vigorous antitrust enforcement to rein in the unchecked power of the packers, and if need be, bust them up. I look forward to working with this committee to bring about greater fairness for family farmers and ranchers. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Larue. And next up, via video, Mr. Miller.
Grassley, members of the Judiciary Committee, thank you for inviting me here today. I proudly represent Tyson Foods, a company based in Springdale, Arkansas. I lead our beef and pork businesses from Dakota Dunes, South Dakota. We are a company based in rural America. In fact, I speak to you today, first and foremost, as a grandson of Iowa farmers. See, I was born and raised in Northwest Iowa farm country in a small town called Ruthven. In rural communities across the country, every year, Tyson invests more than $15 billion with over 11,000 independent pork producers, cattle producers, and poultry producers. We rely on these farmers and producers and want them to be successful because without a steady pipeline of livestock, we're unable to run our business. The present divide between live cattle and boxed beef prices is not the result of a consolidated industry, lack of competition, or the cash markets. The concentration of ownership within the meat processing industry is virtually unchanged over the past 30 years. Instead, the present spread between live cattle and beef prices has everything to do with the law of supply and demand. Multiple unprecedented market shocks, including a pandemic and severe weather conditions this past year, led to an unexpected and drastic drop in processors' abilities to operate at capacity. This led to an oversupply of live cattle and an undersupply of beef, all while demand for beef products is at an all-time high. So it should not surprise any of us that as a result, the price for cattle fell while the price for beef rose. While Tyson does not and cannot control market forces, our success depends on the entire beef supply chain being properly incentivized to meet America's continued demand for higher quality beef. Accordingly, at Tyson, we are committed to ensuring fair compensation for ranchers and farmers, and we're proud that we have relationships with producers of all sizes that stretch back for generations. Producers decide for themselves how to best market and sell their cattle. With Tyson, they have a variety of options available, whether that be on the negotiated cash market, forward contracting, or tailored alternative marketing agreements, or AMAs. Many of our producers prefer tailored agreements because they provide a stable and reliable market for their cattle. The agreements also help meet expectations for consistently higher quality beef, as well as demand for customer-specific programs. This is just not Tyson's view. The U.S. Department of Agriculture concluded that the use of AMAs, and I quote, provides livestock buyers and sellers with improved risk management options that lowers costs or allow for the creation and capture of greater value. I would also point out that our agreements don't lock a producer into selling only to Tyson. They are free to sell to whoever they choose. So Tyson must incentivize producers to continue to sell the cattle to us. We welcome competition because it makes us all better, and it helps put more affordable, higher quality food on American tables. And I can tell you that the competition is intense. Customers have multiple meat suppliers from which to choose, and they put suppliers through competitive bidding processes based on the terms that the customers specify. Finally, I'd point out that feeding this growing country while meeting consumers' evolving demands requires operating efficiently. This has been especially important while navigating the unprecedented market shocks we faced over the past 18 months. With labor shortages across the country, some producing facilities and some production facilities were idled. However, Tyson was able to quickly adjust operations including reconfiguring our production lines, diverting animals to other facilities, and rerouting our transportation network. This allowed us to keep protein products flowing to communities across the nation. Most importantly, our breadth of resources and diverse capabilities enabled us to keep our team members better protected during the pandemic. For example, we have spent more than $700 million related to COVID, including sourcing PPE, bringing medical providers on site, installing protective barriers, and providing on-site testing and vaccinations. In conclusion, for nearly a century, Tyson has been proud to play an important role in feeding this country and also protecting our food supply chain, all while helping to make protein accessible and affordable. So I thank this committee for the opportunity to be here today and to talk about our role, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Schulpepper from JBS.
Good afternoon, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, Co-Woman Klobuchar, and other members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. My name is Tim Schulpepper. I am president of the JBS Fed Beef Division, JBS USA Food Company. I'm a fourth-generation farmer, and I operate the farm that my great-grandfather originally settled in 1887. I have led the JBS Beef Division since 2017 and have been in the protein industry for 35 years. JBS USA and Pilgrim's Pride USA are leading producers of beef, pork, and poultry in the United States. With 84 facilities across the United States employing more than 66,000 team members, we contribute millions of dollars each day to local communities through purchases of livestock, poultry, and plant supplies. It is JBS's mission to ensure the best products and services for our customers, a relationship of trust with our suppliers, profitability for our shareholders, and the opportunity of a better future for all of our team members. We do this through significant, targeted investments in every area of our business and giving back to the local communities where we live and work. For example, we are investing more than $130 million in the U.S. beef industry to increase production capacity. We are investing $70 million in the local communities through our Hometown Strong program. The most significant challenge facing our industry today is labor availability. To operate our facilities safely, efficiently, and at capacity, we need a consistent and skilled workforce. In our beef division alone, we are investing more than $150 million in annualized pay increases to attract and retain new workers. Today, average wages across our beef facilities are more than $22 an hour. Our starting wages are approximately $20 per hour. We also invest in our team's education through our Better Futures program, which provides upfront, free tuition to community college for our team members and their dependents. Likewise, sustainability, achieving more with less, is at the forefront of our culture. JBS is leading the protein industry with a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2040. We will invest more than $1 billion over the next 10 years in emission reduction projects and $100 million by 2030 in on-farm research and development. Without question, the COVID-19 pandemic challenged all of society and critical infrastructure industries, forcing everyone to make every resource available to face this unprecedented threat. Using the best guidance available, we immediately implemented health and safety procedures to keep our team members safe and to continue critical operations. Additionally, we invested more than $600 million in our response to the pandemic, which included voluntarily removing vulnerable populations with full pay and benefits, hosting vaccine clinics at our plants, and providing incentives for our team members to receive vaccines. Today, nearly 75% of JBS USA team members have been vaccinated. The cattle and beef markets are cyclical, and decisions made by producers today may not be realized until years from now. Historically, cattle were sold in lots, and every animal in the lot received the same average price, preventing producers from receiving increased returns for higher quality beef that met consumer demands. Following the cattle crash of the 1970s and 1980s, when beef lost about 50% of the consumer market share, cattlemen joined together to create alternative marketing arrangements with processors. These alternative marketing arrangements, or AMAs, provide a mechanism for producers to realize premium prices for the investments they make in superior genetics, herd health management, and marketing. They also help to ensure a consistent supply of high-quality cattle for processing that result in a consistent supply of high-quality beef options at the meat case for consumers. It is important to note that JBS purchases from cattle feeders of all sizes. AMAs help ensure producers capture more of the consumer beef dollar in an industry where cattle often change ownership 2 to 3 times after they leave the farm or the ranch. JBS is committed to supporting innovation, transparency, and enhancing incentives to keep the U.S. cattle industry ahead of competition and abroad. We will continue to invest in our people, our processing facilities, and communities to help ensure a sustainable, affordable, and resilient food supply. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. I believe our next witness is Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify on the health and competition in the food supply chain. My name is David Smith. I'm the president and CEO of Associated Wholesale Grocers, or AWG, which is based in Kansas City, Kansas. AWG supplies over 3,100 supermarkets in 28 states, and I'm testifying today on behalf of the National Grocers Association, which is the national trade association for independent community grocers and their wholesalers. Independent community grocers punch way above their weight. They account for 1.2% of the nation's overall economy and generate 1.1 million jobs. AWG is a cooperative, which means we're owned by independent retailers that we service, and our profits are all returned to those retailers. We have approximately 1,100 owner shareholders or family businesses. Our cooperative structure is like a farmer-owned cooperative, but instead of selling food to the suppliers, we buy it for our retailers. We aggregate our collective resources and purchasing power, which then helps us establish economies of scale and buy products in bulk. This allows us to keep prices low for our stores and their customers. Our purchasing power equates to roughly $22 billion in retail sales annually. But even though our volume is substantial and have the same efficiencies as our largest competitors, we don't really compete on a level playing field. We pale in comparison to our dominant chain rivals. As Senator Klobuchar mentioned earlier, the top 5 retailers dominate over 65% of the marketplace. These dominant grocery retailers, we call power buyers, use their size and their positions as gatekeepers to the American consumer to dictate terms and conditions to suppliers. This ranges from more favorable pricing, more favorable packaging, and access to exclusive products that we can't get. Their size and market power alone enables them to secure advantages for themselves and harm the smaller players in the food retail marketplace. And this pandemic has really put this problem on full display. Everyday Americans who rely on community grocers have not been able to access the products they need to feed their families, as the largest retailers demand priority to high demand products like cleaning supplies, paper products, and shelf-stable items. The problem of retail consolidation and also buying power is also why we've ended up with this meatpacking conundrum. Consolidation at retail causes consolidation upstream in the supply chain, and meatpacking is a stark example. Suppliers respond to retail consolidation by consolidating rapidly themselves in hopes that getting bigger will allow them to gain leverage against that retail domination. We see consolidation everywhere, from the protein markets to consumer packaged goods and even private label manufacturing. These problems begin with buyer power in the grocery aisle. The results are predictable. Farmers and ranchers struggle to get fair prices as fewer firms compete for the product. Consolidated supply chains are more vulnerable to disruption, as we saw with the meat during the pandemic. and smaller food suppliers face high barriers to entry to reach grocery consumers. The independent segment is best at providing these opportunities for small-scale producers like independent meat packers or small farmers, but our share of the market has shrunk in the face of rapid consolidation. In the last 25 years, grocery store fronts have shrunk by a third, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. During the same time period, we've seen a concerning pattern of food desert growth, particularly in rural and low-income communities. Full-service grocery stores have often been replaced by limited assortment dollar stores, and this not only threatens the public health, including growing rates of diet-related diseases, but also when a grocery store leaves a community, it's deadly to a small local economy. This spiral of supply chain consolidation and shrinking access to food coincides with the absence of antitrust law enforcement. A legal standard meant to protect consumer welfare is doing just the opposite. Americans who happen to live in communities served by an independent grocer are faced with paying higher prices and fewer options and are left behind in supply crunches. At the same time, dominant firms rake in record profits, get preferential terms, and engage in a pattern of behavior that wipes out competition. I like to call one of those anti-competitive tactics harvest and invest. They invest by using their buying power and cash position to lower prices that their competition can't meet. Then, once they're the last man standing, they harvest by increasing prices at will. As a grocer of more than 40 years, I've seen it happen over and over again. It's why rural towns like Mitchellville, Iowa, and urban communities like in the south side of Chicago can only rely on dollar stores for their grocery needs. Senators, if you've ever been to one of those stores, you know they're not where a family can find healthy foods and abundant choices. But senators, we do have a choice. We can choose to end these unfair schemes. We can choose to support fairness for retailers, suppliers, farmers, and consumers. We can choose to enforce antitrust laws that ensure robust competition throughout the food supply chain. I thank all of you for inviting me here today to share AWG's story with you on behalf of Americans' independent community grocers and wholesalers. And I'll be happy to take your questions when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And our last witness is George Slover. Is that correct, George? You've been here before.
Yes, Senator. Yes, I have.
I'm glad to have you back from
Thank you.
Consumer Reports. Take it away.
Thank you. Competition is key to a marketplace that works for consumers at the end of the supply chain. It gives us choice to comparison shop. That spurs businesses to improve quality and affordability. And nowhere are quality and affordability more important than the food we eat. Too many of us, especially in remote rural and marginalized urban areas, lack good food options, a problem aggravated by overconcentration. You've heard today from farmers and ranchers who must sell their produce and livestock to a dwindling number of larger and more powerful packers and processors. It's also a consumer problem. For the marketplace to work for us, it has to be working for everyone, farm to table. That's how we get our choices. When powerful packers or processors or high-volume distributors or retailers push producers to sell at cut rate or risk being cut off, pressure to cut corners can hurt quality, variety, safety, and nip innovation in the bud. Some might think consumers should be happy for producer prices to be pushed down. Doesn't that mean we also pay less? It doesn't work that way. Market power takes from everyone, producers and consumers alike. Producers also face overconcentration for inputs, seed and genetics, fertilizer and chemicals, feed and additives, and farm equipment. One illustration: overconcentration has dramatically restricted how ranchers can market their cattle. 2 short generations ago, the top 4 beef packers had a third of the market, and ranchers had options. Typically, cattle sold on the spot market, priced day of sale by competitive bidding, even live auction, the ultimate in competitive bidding. A feedlot might have a dozen packers show up. Today, after a merger cascade, the top 4 packers control 85%. These multi-billion-dollar giants know how to stay out of each other's way. Now a feedlot might have 1 packer show up. No auction, no bidding, no negotiation. Today, most cattle are purchased in advance, long-term contracts, prearranged prices, giving packers a captive supply and magnifying their control. Cattle, like other farm animals and crops, are perishable. They're carefully fed to be at their peak. A rancher can't just hold them back for the next sale date. Ranchers get pushed to cut corners beyond what makes sense. Some may give up. Either way, it can diminish what's available to consumers. And ranchers are most likely to be run off for trying innovative methods that don't obey the business model dictated by the packers. These packers can also cut deals with high-volume distributors and retailers that close them off to smaller, innovative packers. There are also more acute vulnerabilities. COVID outbreaks caused widespread meatpacking plant shutdowns. Consumers found empty shelves at the grocer, while producers were forced to kill off millions of animals that couldn't be brought to slaughter. This spring, a ransomware attack forced JBS to shut down all its U.S. plants, 1/4 of all our beef. These jolts remind us that competition is about far more than just dry economic efficiency. When the food supply chain is disrupted, it can be literally a matter of life and death. Many competition problems in the food supply chain are the same we see elsewhere and will benefit from the same reforms. A bill by Senator Klobuchar and other members of this committee has a number of proposals that would promote more competitive, better functioning marketplaces, such as by strengthening the law against harmful mergers and against dominant corporations using their muscle to freeze out competition. A bill by Senators Klobuchar, Grassley, and Durbin would strengthen enforcement resources by raising filing fees on the largest mergers. A new bill by Senators Lee and Grassley contains proposals we hope will also be part of discussions leading to bipartisan consensus. And USDA is considering other measures to improve food supply chain resilience and competitive functioning. This hearing will help inform these efforts. Strengthening competition can give us better food choices at more affordable prices and a more resilient food supply chain that can better weather storms, foreseen and unforeseen. Thank you again.
Well, thank you, Mr. Slover. I'm going to start the questioning, and let me start with a question for Mr. Schulpepper and Mr. Miller. Mr. Schulpepper, in your testimony, you say, and I quote, "The most significant challenge facing our industry, JBS, is labor availability. You say that, quote, to operate our facilities safely, efficiently, and at capacity, we need consistent, skilled labor. So I'd like to ask each of you, what percentage of your processing workforce would you estimate are immigrants?"
Senator Durbin, this is Tim Schulpepper from JBS. Thank you for the question. I don't have that particular piece of information in front of me. I would have to get back with that information to you, Senator.
I wish you would. Mr. Miller, do you know?
And, Senator, thank you for the question. As an important employer in many of our communities, we rely on immigrant labor in a lot of our facilities to for one, we give a lot of these folks an opportunity and provide them an entry point. I don't have the specific numbers, but I will tell you that we have several team members that come from diverse backgrounds, and they're going to speak more than 50 different languages. And really, it's a true reflection of America itself. Coming back with an actual percentage or a number like that is something I'm going to have to follow up with you on.
Thanks. I wish you would. Let me just say this. According to the Migration Policy Institute, immigrants make up about 40% of the meatpacking workforce. No surprise to me. Go to Bairdstown, Illinois, and see who's working in the processing plant there. I can tell you half of them are speaking Spanish, and many of them are from Africa. I know that because of the naturalization ceremonies we have in Springfield, and I meet their families. I make that point because there are some members of this committee who are opposed to immigration. They say we've got enough. These people are going to come here and take away American jobs. These are tough jobs in meat processing. I think we all know that, those of us who have any familiarity with it. And townspeople don't really line up in a queue waiting for the opportunity for a lot of these jobs. And so people who are trying to put together a meat processing facility turn to immigrant labor. And I believe that they're skillful and dependable, and over again, they've proven that. Mr. Schaben, I just asked Senator next to me where Dunlap was, and he showed me it on a map. And you're really far west, aren't you?
Real close to Omaha, Nebraska. Yep.
So where do most of your ranchers process their food? Their cattle? Where do they send them?
If they are in for a finishing process, there is a Tyson plant at Dakota City, Nebraska. Cargill plant at
is that processing?
Final processing. Final processing. Yeah, actually, our proximity to the meat packers is decent, but unfortunately, we're real close, 15 miles from my hometown. We saw the effects of losing a packer. Tyson shut their plant down in Denison, Iowa. I think I don't know this. I think it might be their most recent shutdown of a plant.
In your testimony, you talk about the plants that have shut down.
Yeah, that was specific to that one. We've had several in Iowa, and then another one I think that's meaningful in Iowa, Chairman. We talk about these startup companies. We had a great example of an independent coming into Iowa. It was at Tama, Iowa, which is in kind of central Iowa. They get up and get going and have a marvelous market, a new buyer in the marketplace, something that we all cherish. And when they got up and got going good, and I assume the profits or the plant is profitable, they sold out to one of these 4 packers. It's probably one of the things we talk about in this committee that when is it too concentrated? And I can promise you losing that buyer in the marketplace was pretty significant to the producers in the Midwest, because not only Iowa people supplied cattle, but there would have been Minnesota and Missouri and Illinois people that would have supplied that plant.
Well, I'd like to ask the gentleman who's from the grocery wholesalers. My impression at the market, the price of beef is up. That's what I seem to see when I walk through it, either in Springfield or in Chicago. And yet we've heard from some of the producers here that unless you're in on the deal with one of these 4 major producers, it's a struggle. So how do we resolve that contrast, that the market for the consumer is more expensive, and yet when it comes to the profitability of beef, those who are raising beef, cattle ranchers and such, it's not a profitable operation? Mr. Smith?
Yes, sir. The answer is, I guess from our perspective, it certainly is not at the supermarket level. So the cost of the product going to the stores is up a significant amount. And whenever I think back to during the pandemic, and when the retails were the highest and the wholesale cost to our stores was the highest, there wasn't a direct correlation, as many of you have mentioned, back to what was being paid to the farmer. Now, of course, it is supply and demand, and there were a lot of challenges for them in actually doing the production. But independent supermarkets were unique in that time frame, Mr. Chairman, in that many of them the vast majority continues to do all of their in-store cutting from primals. And so they didn't go through central processing facilities. They were much more nimble and were able to stay in business with fresh meat. They also were able to take up some of the slack that was in the restaurant supply chain, being able to repurpose that product. But as far as the pricing today, we know what we pay for it, but we don't necessarily have a view exactly the drivers behind those increases.
Thank you, sir. Senator Grassley.
Yeah, just so you can plan, I hope we can have a second round unless oh, okay, thank you. Mr. Miller, my first question is for you. Iowa cattle producers tell me that during the first week of May this year, Tyson's was buying cattle from independent producers. Wasn't buying cattle. With so few players in the market, that gives producers limited options. Noted in Mr. Schaben's testimony, and according to data from the National Daily Cattle and Beef Summary Report at USDA, the marketing service, on May 10th of this year, the choice box beef cutout was valued at more than $309 per hundredweight. At the same time, cattle producers struggled to break even, receiving average bids of approximately $118 per hundredweight. The gross package market, packer market, on the average steer weighing approximately 1,400 pounds with a 63% dressing percentage exceeded $1,000 per head. How do you justify making such low bids when you're turning such a significant profit?
So thank you for the question, Senator. First and foremost, as I said in my testimony, my oral testimony and the written testimony, we depend on independent cattle operations of all sizes, and we can't do without all of them. I don't know the specific date you referenced in May, what we were doing in the marketplace that day versus another day, but what we pay Iowa cattle feeders truly depends on the market conditions. But how they end up deciding to sell their cattle, whether they want to negotiate or put them on an AMA, is totally up to them. For instance, in the upper Midwest, a larger percentage of cattle feeders prefer to use cash basis as a method to sell their livestock. And as you go further into the South, they prefer the AMAs. So the AMAs guarantee a market for these specialized cattle, but they also ensure that the producer is compensated for the value that they add to the market. So in a long-winded answer, I guess, when you look at the AMAs versus the negotiated trade, the AMAs unlock value that the customer and ultimately the consumer are looking for.
I hope you know how depressing that is when you're not making money and packers are making $1,000 a head and the price of beef at the supermarket isn't down at all. Mr. Schulpepper, are independent producers who negotiate offered the same opportunities to market their cattle as large or corporate feedlots do through formula contracts? And would you be opposed to having the base price, premiums, and any discounts shared with the public?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We are active in the cash market every single day at JBS. In fact, in the state of Iowa, we have several buyers that are headquartered there. Again, active participants, are they offered the same price? Yes, they are, on a cash basis, on a day in, day out basis. Relative to publishing contract terms or some type of contract library, I would need to understand that. I understand there's dialogue in the industry about that. I would need to do more research on that and to learn more about that issue, Senator.
Without having that information, we don't have transparency, and those that negotiate every day on a daily basis don't know for sure what the price is, and so having that information available is very important to have the transparency that's necessary in the price discovery. Mr. Miller, producers in Iowa tell me they can't find bidders for their fed cattle, and it's a take it or leave it situation where they feel like price takers, and then producers are telling me the packer won't accept their cattle for delivery for several weeks. How do you defend this as an open and fair marketplace?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think the way that I would frame this up is, and if you rewind the tape here to some degree and you think about what we've all been navigating with COVID, I think, Senator, the best way to frame this up I think it simplifies it is taking 6 days worth of processing to get 5 days worth of cattle harvested and processed. So in a sense, our teams are working 6 days a week, virtually every week right now, to work through 5 days worth of harvest, our cattle that are harvested. We can out harvest, but we can't get them processed. So in a sense, what we're having to do is we're having to revert back to only being able to harvest and process what we know we can get through our plants. That's reducing our throughput through our facilities. On the other side of it, we do contract cattle in Iowa. The volumes vary, but they're mostly market driven. The cattle do have to be a specific type and kind to fill our customer specifications, but we do contract cattle in Iowa and we do bid on cattle in Iowa. In fact, we also go to the sale barns in the state of Iowa and negotiate. However, sale barn cattle are not included in the negotiated trade as livestock mandatory reporting is set up today. In fact, we do purchase and we do negotiate cattle at sale barns.
I'll yield at this point.
Senator Blumenthal?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. This hearing really affects all Americans. Obviously, senators from the Midwestern states have the biggest state in the production of beef and other agricultural products, but Connecticut also is a producer, and certainly all of us in Connecticut are consumers. And what we're seeing impacting consumers all around the country is a bottleneck supply chain that is the result of consolidation, bigness, that's been permitted under both Republican and Democratic administrations. So this hearing is not a partisan exercise. Today, the beef industry is dominated by the big four, as you all know. They are the titans that package an astonishing 85% of the American beef slaughtering and packaging. 35 million cattle are slaughtered in the United States annually, and that's 26 billion pounds of beef, and it's done at 50 plants. They account for 98%. We've also seen the rapid consolidation in the foods supply chain at the retail level, as you well know. And now, entering this market is Amazon, which has used its economic power to bulldoze its way into new markets, not just groceries, with the purchase of Whole Foods, but also entertainment, audiobooks, smart devices, gaming. Every time our antitrust enforcers have taken a narrow view and given these acquisitions the green light. I would like to ask what you see as the impact of Amazon's entry through its purchase of Whole Foods, as well as the data-rich resources that it is gaining through Amazon Prime and the Amazon Marketplace, enhancing the power of its acquisition. Amazon has unique access to vast troves of data that none of you can lay claim to. And that economic power, I fear, will aggravate the kinds of bottlenecks that we've seen in our supply chain. By tying Amazon Prime membership to discounts at Whole Foods and opening a new line of Amazon Fresh grocery stores, Amazon has cleared another path to potential monopolization of commerce. And it's on track to double its sales over the next 5 years and overtake Walmart as America's dominant grocer. Is that a cloud on the horizon so far as you all are concerned?
Senator, from Farmers Union's perspective, we certainly have grave concerns about the growing level of concentration throughout the entire food chain. Today's focus on the beef packers, I think, tells a story, though, that resonates through that. So as we look at what that means throughout the rest of the chain and for big players like Amazon, what was once, I think, kind of maybe even laughable or not a vision that anybody could imagine. It wouldn't be too surprising to see an Amazon even acquiring one of the big four in a market like this. And the consequences of that would be devastating. We've seen vertical integration and the impact that that has on certainly family farmers and ranchers, but all the way up the chain, it would have devastating consequences.
Senator, Senator, this is David Smith with AWG. I think about it in your home state and our sister cooperative, Wakefern, with the ShopRights and the Price Right stores that you have there and competing. The situation with Amazon is really just a further expansion of these power buyers. The meat discussion we're having today is really a single ingredient in an overall situation that is created when you have these power buyers. Companies such as the manufacturers and producers are unable to be able to get the pricing that they need because of the tremendous dominance that they have. When a singular retailer can have 30 or 35% of all of your sales, but yet you and your products may represent 1% or less of that retailer's sales, there's a disproportionate risk. And so those power buyers, what I was speaking about earlier with Harvest and Invest, in Amazon, I think they may have defined it. I think they may have actually came up with the very definition for Harvest and Invest by leveraging Amazon Web Services to produce incredible income in order to be able to get into the retail business. And so is that an existential threat to supermarkets? Yes. Is it an existential threat to suppliers? Of course. But having so much of an aggregated tower with those companies it's a tremendous risk.
Senator, those concerns you expressed resonate with us across the entire economy. And here in the food supply chain, in the retail grocery sector, it would be indeed ironic if some of the grocers, the chain store grocers who now dominate that segment start expressing concerns about Amazon's entry and overconcentration at that level.
Thank you. Well, I can't say you heard it here first because you didn't hear it here first. It's a question and a fear that I think is shared widely throughout your industries and across the country. And it's one of the reasons we're here today. It affects beef, but as you've rightly pointed out, many other products are at risk as well in terms of competition that benefits consumers and the producers. So I think it's important.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Next up, Senator Lee.
Thank you. Mr. Schaben, I'd like to start with you. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, I'm a proud sponsor of something called the PRIME Act. This is an act that recognizes that some of our problem relates to regulatory bottlenecks, and this is a piece of legislation that would allow states to exercise their regulatory jurisdiction over meat packing plants that operate solely intrastate and would free local packing facilities from costly federal regulation, which is right now exclusive. It's pervasive. You can't get around it, except in very, very rare circumstances. Now, as I understand it, the large meat packers process about 85% of beef. And I've also been told that these big players no longer purchase many animals, if any animals at all, from smaller feeders or producers. And so the average cow-calf operator now is in a strange position because the average cow-calf operator owns about 40 head of cattle. If these dynamics are correct, then the little guy, the smaller producer, is in real trouble. In your opinion, Mr. Schaben, would the PRIME Act allow these smaller suppliers greater access to the marketplace?
Senator, thanks for the question. A couple comments. I don't, and in my testimony, I don't think I've ever mentioned that or said that these large meat packers do not don't participate in the cash market or don't participate in with smaller producers, because actually I don't think that's factually correct. They probably do. It's at what level that we are concerned about and what level of transparency that is done. So as small scale producers, do we have all the access to information to make the best marketing decisions that we can? And are we at a disadvantage to somebody that's significantly bigger that gets, quote unquote, a better deal? In relationship to your Prime Act, first of all, I commend you for, I think in my state of Iowa and around, small local processors have been tough to stay in business. I could only imagine that regulation would be one of those things. So I think anything that we could do to make local processing better for local producers is a great thing. In relationship to your act, the only thing, and the reason I won't comment when it comes to food safety in relationship to inspection regulations, I am not near expert enough to comment directly on that. But the thought process of it making it easier for those small scale producers to operate seems fantastic to me, because we've just, in our local communities, we've watched these smaller locker plants just, literally dissolve. And what we did find out in our COVID, through our COVID system, is that the supply chain and the ability to participate in that did get broken. So a lot of smaller producers were looking for avenues just like you're talking about. And we were shut out of some of those because, you might talk around to book a spot or two to get a local process now could be a year out, could be longer than a year out. And obviously that's not been, it's probably because, just exactly like you say, they've been overregulated.
Right. And over time, people have assumed that it always has to be this way. Of course, the federal government is not a government of general jurisdiction. It doesn't have general police powers. It has specifically enumerated powers. One of those powers, the one that's invoked here, is the power to regulate interstate commerce. And there's no reason. It's understandable why for meat packers that operate nationally or across state lines and they're selling interstate, it's understandable why that there might be some good reasons to have a federal meat inspection system there. There's no reason why it ought to apply for intrastate operations. That same access that you acknowledge, presumably, that same access could help improve the ability of producers to get competitive prices for their animals, right? If you had someplace else to go, that could open things up for you a little.
Anything that creates more capacity in a competitive market-related thing is good. So in this instance, if you're processing your own, then the market, the spot market, probably doesn't mean as much to you. But from an industry standpoint, yes, increase processing capacity is one factor, is one thing that we're all talking about. So it sure when I saw your bill when it first came out, looked to me like not knowing all the innards of how we regulate inspection services looks like a great deal to increase capacity.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've got one more question I wanted to ask. Is that all right? Thank you. Mr. Miller, if social distancing mandates required packers to operate with slower chain speeds during COVID, we shouldn't be surprised that the reduction in supply led to increased costs. That slowing of production would naturally result in higher prices for consumers. So I'd first like to know whether that's right, and then what would happen if retail prices, if the government mandates that packers run less efficient businesses, or we increase costs by requiring you to pay USDA inspectors more, would that also result in higher costs to the consumer?
So thanks for the question, Senator Lee. A couple things here. So yes, if you go back to the pandemic, yeah, we were throttled back considerably, but it was really specifically driven around the fact that we didn't have the team members to come into the facility to work. And so therefore the chain speeds, the amount of pounds we were producing was curtailed dramatically. Since then, we've been able to get some of our chain speed back, but we're still not back to the level we need to be and back to pre-COVID levels. So as a result of that is we're producing less food through our facilities than when we were prior to COVID. So prices have moved up as a result of that from a supply-demand economics perspective.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Lee. Mr. Smith, America has a monopoly problem, and I discussed it in the opening. It affects many different businesses, from cat food to caskets. And we now have about 1/3 fewer grocery stores across the country than we had 25 years ago. How does the loss of local grocery stores impact consumers, especially in rural communities?
Well, fantastic question, Senator. I guess let me tell you a story. One of our member retailers, which operates several different stores, and he already competes with the largest retailer here in the U.S. And he had been receiving a lot of requests to open a new store in an area that really only had a super center there to serve the needs. And they wanted a full service supermarket with really great prepared foods and everything else. And so he did his homework. And prior to going into the town, he had a service do a full book retail price check to make sure that the retail pricing there was comparable to the other markets where he was at, that he was already competing with that competitor. And sure enough, he found that it actually was higher. So he checked that off the list and said, that's not really a concern. And he spent millions of dollars preparing the facility and opened it up. And after opening, the retail pricing in that market, because it was isolated, he was kind of carved out. And the retail prices there at that competing store undercut him at every turn. And anecdotally, from the people from that competitor store, we were hearing that that the store lost millions of dollars during that period of time that store was open. And our member lost millions of dollars from his family business and ultimately closed. To put that back in,
Okay.
yes.
I think that it's an example, too, of how it is to be a new entrant as a small business. Just a quicker answer on this one. What about the dominance of power buyers and their anti-competitive behavior? How does that affect independent grocers?
Yeah, so the power buyer, it isn't directly related to efficiencies. It's a misnomer. And what I was speaking to a moment ago is that this notion of consumer welfare, Senator, is that the consumer is benefited by the lower prices, but those are very short term. And actually, they pay more because of that harvest and invest. They invest in those areas to drive out competition. And then after the competition goes away, it increases. So the power buyers are using that positioning against the manufacturer, which they've even cited in their own SEC filings, that's one of the biggest threats against their ability to compete for the manufacturers, because it's not proportionate to the risk, as I mentioned earlier. If it's 35%, yeah, it's
I'll ask you some more questions later on the record about how we can fix this, because I want to go on to a few other things. Mr. Schaben, second-generation family farmer, as you explained. Could you tell us about how the price paid for your cattle has changed over the course of your career? Do you think farmers like you will be able to survive into the next generations?
We have, yes, and thanks for the question, Senator. The price that we've received, I think what's changed, and what I mentioned before, was the percentage of the retail dollar. That's the thing, I guess, for me, is the simplest to go off of, as it just has eroded down, as I mentioned before, from 50 cents of that dollar in 2015 to now down, I think, to 37 cents of the dollar that we receive that's spent on beef. And if you spend all this time and effort to promote your product and to do it in the marketplace and you don't get it.
Let me just follow up with Mr. Miller, Mr. Schulpepper. Why do you think the farmer share has dropped so significantly and so fast?
Thanks for the question, Senator. There's a couple things that play into that, and similar to other commodities, you can take into consideration chocolate or coffee, for example. The value in today's food often comes from its processing and items being further valued up the supply chain. For example, in our industry, more is being done to prepare food before it even gets to the table. Hence the reason more items are cut, marinated, breaded, pre-cooked, which all adds more value to the product. In addition to that, more people are also eating away from home. This means the farmer is going to receive a smaller share because the price of the restaurant meal typically is going to include preparation, service. We all know the labor situation and the marketing that corresponds with it.
Okay, thank you. You want to answer that as well?
Senator,
Yeah.
the beef industry, thank you for the question. The beef industry fundamentals are based on supply and demand, and so they are going to be shifting over time. At JBS over the last several years, we've worked hard on changing our product mix inside of our plants. More value-added products, more branded products, more products into the food service channel. And so we are doing more and more inside of our facilities that is adding value to that beef, and therefore it's being sold in a different fashion, if you will, to our customers.
Okay. Maybe Mr. Larue, do you want to respond to this? Because Mr. Schaben's shown us how the farmer's share of $1 spent on beef has dropped from 52% in 2015 to about 37% in 2020. And you heard the answers from our witnesses. And how do you respond to that?
I would simply say that when you look at USDA data and you look at the information on how they capture and measure that share of the food dollar for these packages, we are not talking about restaurant investment. We are not talking about a lot of this further processing for these core products. So when we look at this spread, we are indeed capturing that farmers in particular are not only capturing less of that dollar, but indeed some of that money is going elsewhere. But I think what we are talking about today is that spread that's been mentioned before and how much of that dollar is actually being captured somewhere else in the middle, perhaps by the packers.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Slover, do you want to add anything to that, as well as any comments, my last question here on the grocer issues we raised?
So on your last question, I would say it's no coincidence that in this very concentrated supply chain in all these different levels, the two parts that are hurting the most are the least concentrated, the least able to exert any of their own choices against the concentrated levels.
Thank you for summing that up. I think next up we have Senator Hawley.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here. I just want to follow up on this same line of questioning about how we got to this point. Mr. Slover, maybe I'll just start with you. You earlier this year stated in written testimony to the Antitrust Subcommittee that antitrust enforcement has grown weak over the years, in part because courts have tended to require the government to prove demonstrable, concrete, imminent, quantifiable harm. We've noted, I think it's been well documented in this hearing, we've got in the beef sector, we've got four packers, four companies that process 85% of beef in the United States. Over on the pork side, that's three that do 63%. That's pretty dramatic concentration. Can you just give us a sense of how we got to this point? And in particular, I'm wondering, you said earlier in your testimony that we need to reaffirm that acquisitions by the largest corporations that already have significant market power are anti-competitive and unlawful, subject to a clear showing that they're not. Should some of these mergers that led to this kind of concentration, should they have been prevented? I mean, how did we get to this point that we are now with this kind of mass consolidation?
Yeah, I think there was a lull. Most of the mergers that we're talking about in beef packing, at least the first wave of them, were in the 1980s. And there have been some more recent acquisitions of already large companies. JBS is a relatively new entrant in the U.S.-based giants. But it has been a trend of consolidation leading to overconcentration. And then the once you get to that place in a marketplace, the the incentives, the corporate incentives for chasing profits change. And they change in a way that goes against responding to competitive pressures and doing what consumers want because you know that there's somebody else out there ready to do that. So I think, in essence, that's what's brought us to where we are.
Very good. Thank you for that. Mr. Larue, I want to ask you about something that you wrote last year. You had some very pointed words to say about this issue of excessive concentration in the meat industry. You said that price fixing in the meat industry is not a new phenomenon. You talk about the example of a century ago, and then you go on to say, as was true 100 years ago, radical and immediate action is needed to create a fair and balanced food system. What do you have in mind? I mean, what does the response need to be from a policy perspective?
Right. I think it's a combination of things, Senator. It is about shining light on the issue. It is about a greater antitrust review, even a review and look back, as suggested just a moment ago, and really making sure that although today we are hearing a lot of conversation about supply and demand, seasonality, and the way markets fluctuate, all that is very much true. But what should not be happening is coordinated efforts in that space, dark markets. We need a lot more light brought into these markets for fairness, both in terms of the price, but then also in terms of how the packers themselves are functioning as a unit.
I think you mentioned this, but just to put a fine point on it, I mean, how about breaking up some of these packers?
Look, we are all for shining a light, having a review, and if necessary, break them up.
I want to ask you, Mr. Schulpepper, I can't leave this topic without asking you about a consent decree or two that you entered into, your company entered into. In 2018, you entered into a consent agreement with the Department of Ag to pay tens of thousands of dollars in fines after inaccurately recording beef prices, meaning that a number of farmers, shall we say, quite a few, got underpaid. In 2016, USDA found that there were similar problems with reporting inaccurate weights at 2 of your facilities in Texas and in Colorado. That happened because you were using inaccurate scales. In 2018, your company had to pay tens of thousands of dollars more in penalties for doing that. My question to you is, given this, I mean, why wouldn't American farmers be concerned about concentration among meat packers when they're staring down the barrel of practices like those?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We work hard every single day on state, local, and federal laws. This is a very competitive industry. I think it's also keep in mind that we are very active in the cash markets with the producers. Margins do shift. Markets go in cycle. But to answer your question specifically, we work very, very hard to be compliant with all state, federal, and local laws.
Well, I think I'll just say, my time's nearly expired. I'll just say in closing that I can just tell you from hearing from cattle ranchers in my state of Missouri, we're a big beef producing state, from hearing from my own relatives. I happen to marry into a cattle ranching family. My wife is generation number 6, I think it is, born to the ranch. The present situation for particularly small producers, cow-calf operation, is simply untenable. It is untenable. It cannot be sustained. We cannot have this level of concentration in this industry and have the farmer, the rancher, be paid less and less and less, the consumer charge more and more and more. Something is seriously wrong here, and it cannot go on as it currently is. And I, for one, think it's time to take that kind of action you were talking about, Mr. Larue. I think we need antitrust enforcement, and I think we as a committee have got to look forward to some policy suggestions to change the balance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Well said. Next up, Senator Booker, who's with us remotely.
I appreciate that, Chairwoman, and I have to say I feel strongly in alignment with many of the people who've spoken before and really celebrate what Josh Hawley was just talking about. I'm going to submit some questions for the record, but I want to dive in because over the past years, I've been sounding an alarm about how deeply broken America's food system is. We are in a crisis, and now we've seen unprecedented consolidation. Amy Klobuchar has been talking about that with a few multinational corporations now in control of our entire food system. And today I want to spend some time talking specifically about how our meat production system is broken and how it was broken in large part. Really the innovator in this brokenness was Tyson Foods, our nation's biggest meat company. Up to 50 years ago, farmers throughout our country farmed in ways that were very similar to their parents and grandparents, the way they had farmed. In fact, it goes back for generations. This was our precious heritage. But up until about 50 years ago, farmers and ranchers raised livestock in a way that, treated animals humanely, that was environmentally sustainable, and that allowed our farmers and ranchers to really make a decent living. And as our independent family farmers prospered, so did rural communities. Independent businesses such as feed mills, hatcheries, slaughter plants, and food processing facilities created good jobs for rural residents, and the wealth created by farmers circulated throughout those rural communities. Then Tyson's created a vertically integrated business model where they bought up all the independent businesses in the supply chain. And while Tyson's didn't buy up all the farms, they took control of them through the use of restrictive contracts. And these restrictive contracts that Tyson's entered into with farmers forced those farmers to adopt the industrialized model of livestock raising that we have today, a model which poisons our air and our water, tortures animals, and has contract farmers often living below the poverty line and with staggering amounts of debt. In order to compete with this business model, independent family farmers were forced to either get big or get out. And we've seen a massive disappearance of independent family farmers and ranchers in America. Today, Tyson's first brought this model into the chicken market and then expanded it into the hog market. This caused 90% of independent hog farmers to disappear in America and led to higher prices for consumers, but lower prices for the farmers, as Tyson's has kept the difference for themselves. And it led to the horrible hollowing out of rural America, as all of the wealth that used to circulate on Main Street in rural communities among the independent family farmers and independent businesses was sucked into Tyson's corporate headquarters to the benefit of Wall Street. And now the big four meatpacking companies, Tyson's, JBS, Cargill, and National Beef, are trying to do to our cattle ranchers what they did to our independent chicken farmers and pig farmers. And the critical task for Congress that we face now is to make sure this does not happen. In 1980, there were approximately 1.6 million cow-calf operators in the United States. The big four meatpacking companies controlled only 36% of cattle slaughter, and almost all cattle were sold on the cash market. Fast forward to today, and almost half of the cow-calf operators are gone. The big four meatpackers now control over 80% of the cattle slaughter, and only 25% of the cattle are sold on the cash market. And companies like JBS import beef from other countries and deceptively label that meat as product of the USA. Congress needs to act quickly and take action to protect our.
Senator Booker, you went mute.
Thanks a lot, Senator Klobuchar.
Okay.
We need to amend the Packers and Stockyards Act to require that at least 50% of cattle are purchased on the spot market. We need to ban packer ownership of more than 7 days prior to slaughter, and we need to mandate that only cattle born, raised, and slaughtered in the United States are labeled as product of the United States of America. The Farm System Reform Act, which I recently reintroduced this Congress, would do all of these things, but we must actually do more. I'm calling on the Department of Justice, the FTC, the USDA to enforce existing antitrust laws and break up companies like Tyson and JBS, who have gotten so large that they now use their economic and political power to rig the entire system in their favor. And these federal agencies also need to address the extreme levels of concentration in the retail grocery sector, which has now led to suppressed wages and a lack of bargaining power for workers. Thank you, Chairman, and I'm going to put a lot of questions to the witnesses for the record, but I'm very happy to hear a lot of agreement across the aisle on the crisis we have in the American food system. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Senator Cotton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Before I begin the questioning, I'd like consent to enter into the record an article published by Bloomberg News on Monday. It's entitled "Prices for Young Cattle Are Soaring, Signaling Expensive Beef."
It'll be entered in the record. Thank you.
I want to welcome all of our witnesses, both here in person and virtually as well. Mr. Schaben, it's a pleasure to get to visit with you earlier. As a fellow family cow-calf operator, I think your operation is a lot bigger than the Cotton families, thank goodness. But welcome to you all. There's been a lot of talk about price transparency this afternoon in regards to pricing. I want to explore that a little bit more. Mr. Miller, testifying virtually. Under the Mandatory Livestock Reporting Act, Tyson Foods has to report what they pay for cattle and what they sell beef for every day to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Is that right?
Yes, sir, Senator. We actually, under the Livestock Mandatory Reporting Act, we report what we buy for cattle in the morning, and then we turn around and report what we purchase by the end of the day. So those reports go out twice a day. And in fact, there's additional reports that are produced on a weekly basis. So there is plenty of information that can lay out how many cattle were negotiated, how many cattle were purchased under a forward pricing arrangement, and how many cattle were purchased under some sort of alternative marketing agreement. And the same holds true on the boxed beef side of it and pork side of our product sales too. So those products are negotiated, and anything that's negotiated is reported twice a day. And the same thing at the end of the week, there's a weekly report that shows what's been sold globally into the international space, how many pounds. The same thing as what's been sold forward, what's been sold in the spot market. So there is plenty of transparency in this business.
Mr. Schulpepper, is that the same for JBS?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it is.
Okay. Mr. Miller, if someone is interested in finding out those prices you just discussed, where would they go to look up that information?
Yeah, so the USDA, so the AMS division of the USDA publishes it daily. There's a website out there that if I need to, I can get information to all the senators so they can pass it on to your constituents, but it's readily available.
That's quite all right, Mr. Miller. I'm sure everyone can Google. I want to turn to another topic that we've discussed a lot today here, which is concentration in the meat packing segment. Obviously, that has antitrust implications, which is squarely within our jurisdiction. Mr. Miller, do you know about how much of the beef market share Tyson had in 1990?
Yeah, I started with the company in 1992. I would guess that number to be approximately 25%.
What about a decade later in 2000?
That number would have been somewhere near 20, 23, 24%.
And what about last year in 2020?
This past year, we're approximately 20% of the market share.
So your market share for beef has declined over the last 30 years?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Schulpepper, do you know how much beef market share JBS has today?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I do. In total, will be something around 23 or 24%.
Thank you. Mr. Miller, I want to go back to the combined market share now of the four biggest beef firms. In 1994, do you know what their combined market share was?
It was approximately 80%.
What's the combined market share of the four biggest beef firms today?
Yeah, approximately the same level. It's moved, a percentile or two up and down over the past 30 years, but directionally, it's virtually unchanged over the last 30 years.
Okay, a third topic that we've heard a lot about is the price of cattle, and I've heard a lot of references to 2014 and 2015. Do you know what the price was in 2015, Mr. Miller?
I don't have that in front of me. I do know the value of the product in 2014, 2015 was around $2.35, $2.40 a pound.
Yeah, the price was $166, which is pretty high historically. But if you go back 10 years, 2011, it was only $110. If you go back 11 years, it's $88. So obviously, the starting point for some of these figures influences the size of the growth or the decline. I've just got one final question I want to discuss, Mr. Miller. Formula transactions or alternative marketing agreements, AMAs, we've heard a lot about how these are causing cash cattle trade to decline. Can you talk to me, Mr. Miller, about how Tyson uses AMAs and how they help contribute to a sufficient supply of specialty products, and why some producers might choose to use AMAs?
So, yeah, a little bit of background on that. So AMAs, the advent of AMAs have been around for probably 25 to 30 years, maybe even a little bit older than that, but somewhere in that range. And over time, if you go back to the early 1990s as an industry, our typical cattle grade from a meat quality perspective, we were grading somewhere right around 60% choice or higher. This past year in 2020 and 2021 have been record grading years from a quality attribute perspective. Choice or higher has been grading 83 to 85%, and upwards of, if you look at the prime category, which is the category above choice, historically that would be somewhere right around 1 to 3% of the supply would meet that prime grade. And this past year, those numbers have been upwards of 10 to 15%, and we've had tailwinds at times closer to 18%. So the quality that we're supplying our customers is matching what the consumer wants, and that's a better eating experience when it comes to beef.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Miller. My time has expired.
Thank you very much, Senator Cotton. Next up, Senator Hirono, patiently waiting in the wings.
This has been very interesting, so there you go. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have questions for Mr. Miller. In 2019, Immigration and Customs Enforcement conducted raids at a handful of chicken processing plants in Mississippi, carrying out one of the largest immigration raids in recent history, arresting nearly 700 people. In the end, it was the workers who paid the price, and the companies and the people who knowingly hired them faced little, if any, consequences. And then during the pandemic, one of the few times that President Trump used the Defense Production Act was to keep meatpacking plants open. So these people who worked in the meatpacking plants were deemed essential workers. Do you support, Mr. Miller, a pathway to citizenship for such workers?
So first off, thank you for the question, Senator. I'm not familiar with the specific poultry reference you did make. However, I will say this. We believe in a comprehensive immigration reform plan that can help to provide border security, but also proper documentation of future applicants. And as I mentioned earlier, our team members come from diverse backgrounds. And as I mentioned, we have more than 50 languages in our beef and our pork facilities. And they truly reflect the makeup and the thread of what America is itself. And we believe immigration reform, we believe that allowing these immigrants into our communities provides an entry point for many Americans and also immigrants, and we give them an opportunity to thrive and succeed.
Thank you. Has your company taken a public position in support of comprehensive immigration reform, which also basically, up to now in the 2013 immigration reform law, provided a pathway to citizenship? So has your company taken a public position?
So Senator, this is not really an area of expertise for me. I'm not familiar with the position we've taken, but I will go back to my team, and then we can revert back to you and get your response with that.
Well, you just testified that you support comprehensive immigration reform, so that is good news to me. And it would be helpful if other companies who utilize immigrant labor also took that kind of position. Mr. Slover, I was particularly interested in your testimony because you come at it from a consumer standpoint. And you note in your testimony that you support various bills that you listed in your testimony. Is any one of these bills more important in terms of what we should do first to provide more competition in the areas that we're talking about so that it ultimately benefits the consumer?
Well, I listed 3 bills, and one of them is the bill that Senator Klobuchar introduced, S-225, which I believe makes a number of well-founded reforms based on established antitrust and competition principles that we have supported, I think, since before it was introduced. And so I would put that one at the top of the list as the right starting point for bipartisan discussions that need to take place. The bill that Senator Klobuchar introduced with Senator Grassley and Senator Durbin to change the filing fees to raise them on the largest mergers will increase enforcement resources. I think that one's important too. There's also a bill that's been introduced recently by Senator Lee and Senator Grassley that has a number of proposals that we think should also be a part of that mix. So I would start with those three.
So, good. Bipartisan. In the early 20th century, the Justice Department broke up the 5 biggest U.S. meat packers, and we had decades of competition in the beef industry. And after the 5 largest meat packers are broken up, we had a lot of competition apparently in this industry, but we're down to the big 4 now. In your view, is it time to break up the giants in the meatpacking industry once again?
Well, we have refrained so far from calling for a breakup without the investigation that would justify that under existing law or under the principles underlying existing law. We would not be opposed to that if the facts warrant it, and certainly that could bring increased competition and more opportunities up and down the supply chain. So
clearly,
we're not unfavorable towards it.
So right now, the Justice Department, I think, is investigating certain of the corporations in the industry for price fixing. That's a per se violation of the antitrust laws. But when you have so few players, you have a lot of parallel behavior going on. I think you call it accommodating reactions. So we may be at the point for our consumers to really look at breaking up these big companies. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Next up, Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome to the witnesses. Competition is critical to our economy. Competition helps workers, helps employers, and it helps consumers to lower prices and to increase quality. I'm concerned about the very real lack of competition in the meatpacking industry. In 1988, the 4 largest companies controlled 70% of the market. That share grew to 81% of the market in 1999. Today, the market share of those 4 companies, that oligopoly, is now at 85%. We need to make sure that even in the face of market concentration, there remains real and meaningful competition and price transparency. So, Mr. Schaben, I'd like to start with you. In your judgment, what steps can Congress or the USDA take to bring more transparency in pricing, to ensure competition, and to facilitate more negotiation between producers and packers?
Senator, thanks, and I appreciate your comments. I think there are several things, and I do think some of those are addressed in what we refer to as Senator Grassley's 5014 bill. And one thing I want to be clear about, we're hearing a lot about these alternative marketing agreements. We're not dictating how people market their cattle. What we're trying to see is that it's done in a competitive fashion and that it's not done to take competition away, the very thing that you have stressed from the second you started speaking. It's vital. It's vital to all our industries. And somehow through this, through our beef business, they've tried to take that away from us and tried to take the competition. So I think there's a number of things. Better when we talk about livestock market reporting, a better system to know exactly what's going on in relationship to how the marketing agreements, what they constitute, so producers have an idea of what they're doing. More cash trade, and those alternative marketing agreements, they keep talking about producing, bringing the quality of the product up. The northern cattle feeders have the highest quality, and yet we have the lowest alternative marketing agreement. So I don't see the correlation that I keep hearing here today. We just think we need a robust a system of how to do it. We think an enforcement of the Packers and Stockyards Act, which was put in place, ironically, after they broke up the Big Five, that came into play. And that's why I guess I'm here to beg you as a committee. I think what producers are asking for is just a fair playing field. We like the game. We're up for the fight. We just want the rules to be fair.
So what would help produce a fair playing field? What would ensure that capital are able to be moved at a fair market value?
Well, one thing that takes so much away today is all the contracted cattle, all the alternative marketing agreements that are contracted. And just like a simple supply and demand, when you have X amount of cattle that are contracted ahead of time, obviously that's going to take away demand for the cash cattle market. And yet all those formula cattle are based off that market. So how great it is, it's a great tool. I credit the Packers for doing it. It's not helping the cash market for producers. So when we talk about the concentration issue, and I don't have the figures in front of me, but just 20 or 30 years ago, when almost probably 80-90% of cattle are sourced on an open competitive market, that thing is literally flip-flop today, Senator Cruz, where where now our cash in some states can get down to less than 10% of a competitive open market.
And in your experience, what percentage of your business is done on a formula basis?
Well, I don't know the percentage. The state of Iowa and the Midwest is considerably low. As we trend farther south, and I believe into your home state, it gets pretty high. I think their percentage of their formula cattle get there to where it might be in the 90% or more. Once again, how you market them isn't so much. It's how the price is derived. Is it competitive when we do it? As a livestock auction market owner, Senator Cruz, I can tell you the way to fix it is if all of them had to be procured in an open, competitive daily market, but that'd be a little self-serving. The two gentlemen here representing the Packers are customers of mine. They come buy cattle at my market every week, and I'm darn happy to have them. But what's happened over time, and that concentration issue, is to where we used to have 5, 6, 7 buyers, we've got it down to 2. And that is fundamentally a problem. I don't think any of the people in here would disagree that if 20 people are bidding on this bottle of water, it's probably going to bring more than if 1 or 2 are bidding on it. And I think that's what we're trying to accomplish in this through this hearing.
Okay, and let me ask one final question to Mr. Schaben and Mr. Larue. President Biden has proposed as part of his multi-trillion-dollar tax increase, ending the stepped-up basis in tax treatment. How would that impact farmers and ranchers? What kind of damage, what kind of devastation would eliminating stepped-up basis cause for farmers and ranchers all across the country?
Yeah, certainly. I appreciate that. And for Farmers Union, we have communicated very clearly to the administration and to any members of Congress who have proposed that this would have devastating impact on family farmers and ranchers and the ability for them to, quite frankly, remain economically viable in many cases.
Mr. Schaben?
I would have said the exact same thing. The stepped-up basis is helps family farms stay generational. It is a very important thing, I think, to our people and all the customers that I represent. Obviously in the agriculture industry, most of our customers live asset rich and cash poor, and to be in a position at the end to have to not have a stepped up basis probably would see a drastic shift in land ownership, I would think, and pretty scared about that, I guess. So I think Mr. Larue and I are 100% on the same page.
Thank you.
Next up for a second round, I think Senator Blackburn may join us in a while. Oh, I want to mention that Senator Hyde Smith has been with us as well. Thank you for joining us today. Outside of our committee, we always welcome visitors and interested parties. And so, Senator Grassley, you have some additional questions.
Let me add that Senator Hyde-Smith took a very active role in this same subject as a member of the Agriculture Committee and asked some very tough questions on this very issue. I'm going to take off with the recent discussion that Senator Cruz had with you, Mr. Schaben, and also I think it's central to what Senator Cotton asked about. And Senator Cotton asked appropriate questions. He got appropriate answers, and as he should. But when you say that we have the cash market and you report daily, so I'm talking to Miller or Schulpepper, when you say you report twice daily these sales, remember you're reporting on about less than 20% of your sales in most cases. And consequently then, what we need is that other 80% to have transparency so that people that are selling on a cash negotiated basis on a daily basis knows that what they're getting. And if we had that, I don't think we'd be here today with this issue. And it's my understanding from the laws that are already on the books that Secretary Vilsack might have the authority to bring about more transparency in these contracts that are out there. Confidentiality parts of those contracts, so these packers can't give those prices out. Now, what's the reason for keeping that secret? I don't know. I don't understand at all that that should be secret. But if you had 100% of this daily kill being reported, then those people that negotiate price would know exactly what they're getting. So I just think I ought to point that out. There was nothing inappropriate with any of these questions about what transparency there is, but there isn't enough of it. And that's because of these contracts having these confidential clauses or whatever you want to call it in them. So I'm going to go to you, Mr. Schaben. I know your family farm's been in the livestock business since 1950. Besides livestock auctions, your farm includes cow-calf. I'm excited to hear that your kids are also involved in the agriculture. How does the lack of cash trade in other regions impact livestock markets today, like your livestock market?
Well, the lack of cash trade, and if we're right in saying that it brings a more robust, and in this instance, a more price appropriate response back to the cattle feeders, how it makes a great deal is the people that we service, Senator, in our auction markets are the independent cow-calf producers, and so as the price of fed cattle rises, the bids that then go back to the people who produced it from the start get higher. It'll be the quickest way to add value into the rural sector. So that is the big thing that we push about. That money that can get created in this system gets trickled down so fast, and anybody that's been around agriculture knows that that's a continuous wheel that literally goes 24 hours a day, and that money gets recirculated back as good as it goes, and putting it back into rural America is the best we can ask for.
How many, Mr. Schaben, how many packers do you participate with in any given week? Would more competition benefit you and the independent producers?
Well, of course, more competition, Senator, is going to benefit all independent producers. As it was pointed out by Senator Cruz, it's the backbone of our whole society. It's going to benefit it for sure. As far as how we deal with, ironically, the two gentlemen that are represented here today, like I said before, are direct customers of mine. They come to my market every week and participate it, and for that we're very thankful. But over time, what we've seen through consolidation, specifically in my business, to the coal cow market, to what ends up back in the ground beef chain, sir, we have seen such a consolidation in that industry that 20 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, we would have had between 5 and 8 buyers weekly at our market to purchase the cold cows that go back into the hamburger supply chain. We have 2 today. We have 2. And we're so glad we have 2. But we're just afraid that what happens if we go to one, in consolidation, if we go to 1, or I don't know. It's a very scary proposition.
I'm going to ask Mr. Miller and Mrs. Schulpepper, with regard to the Tyson fire and also JBS ransomware attack, the highly concentrated meatpacking industry showed it's extremely vulnerable. Shutting down one plant, even for a few days or weeks or months, backs up production, leads to higher prices for consumers, lower prices for farmers, and meat shortages. Would you agree these disruptions highlight the need for more competition?
So, Senator, thank you for the question. One thing I want to revert back to a statement you had just made and a question you had asked the gentleman prior to me. We do report every purchase. The USDA then takes it from there, whether it's a formula purchase or a negotiated trade, and then they move it into the specific report. The same for the sale of product, whether it's sold on a formula basis or negotiated, it goes into those varying reports. So I just wanted to clarify that for you and the committee.
How does that? Have you answered my question? Would you agree that these disruptions highlight the need for more competition?
So I'd like to speak a little bit on the Holcomb disruption. If you go back, an unexpected disruption similar to this will shock the system, there's no doubt. However, we took measures to lessen the impact of the fire by shifting cattle out of that region to other production facilities to be able to take advantage of our other 5 facilities in the United States here and to increase our harvest capacity in those plants. We also temporarily moved team members around from that Kansas region up into our other facilities to increase our chain speed.
Mr. Miller, you want to answer that question? Would you agree that these disruptions highlight the need for more competition?
So when we talk about competition, we welcome all the competition there is. There's small players, there's large players. As I said in my opening testimony and in the written testimony, the competition is intense. And in fact, if you look at the announcements that have been made in the last 60 to 90 days, there's upwards of 8,000 to 10,000 head of additional harvest capacity that's scheduled to come online over the next several years. So we do welcome more competition.
This will be my last question. You just said that you report data, but it's, as a matter of fact, it's not made public. So would you be okay with removing confidentiality blanket in those contracts?
I'm sorry, Senator, are you referring to a library of contracts? Are you talking about reported trades?
I'm talking about the fact that you say you report daily, or maybe
Yes,
twice a day, all the data, including what's pre-contracted and any other arrangements you have, but that information is not made public. It goes to the USDA. Would you be okay with removing the confidentiality blanket that's in these, that keeps this information from being made public?
So I believe that is a question for the USDA and AMS division to make a decision on that. But I do believe confidentiality plays an important role in this too, especially if there's only one party that's negotiating or trading that specific day. You have to take confidentiality into consideration.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. On remotely, Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and Chair Durbin, and I want to thank in particular Ranking Member Grassley for his leadership on this issue and for putting together a bipartisan coalition that's trying to get a fair shake for cattle farmers in Georgia and in Iowa and across the country. Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. First questions for Mr. Larue. Mr. Larue, there are 15,000 cattle producers in the state of Georgia. And while we're known for peaches and pecans, cattle is actually the fourth largest commodity from our state. And while demand for beef has continued to grow, most cattle producers, like the 87% of Georgia cattle producers who have less than 100 head, don't know whether they will make or lose money on their next calf crop. My question for you, Mr. Larue, is what is the biggest barrier to establishing a more stable and profitable market for Georgia's cattle farmers and cattle farmers across the country?
Very succinctly, it's a lack of competition, transparency, and really shining a light on things also like labels to make sure that consumers are not only being misled, that producers out there are able to market their product in an open and truly truthful way. So, right, I would say first, it's competition. We don't have fair competition right now. The rules and the of fairness need to be rebuilt. And then it's a question of transparency to add to that, and then labeling.
Thank you, Mr. Larue. Appreciate that. Mr. Schaben, as I said, there's about 15,000 cattle producers in Georgia, around 1 million farms nationwide, and they all compete against each other. But most of the livestock winds up going to one of just 4 packers. Mr. Schaben, who would you say has the biggest influence on the short-term demand for the cattle you sell? Is it consumers or is it someone else?
On the short-term demand, meaning, can you rephrase the question?
Yeah, who is driving the demand dynamics and who is setting the prices for your products and the products of farmers in similar position?
If it's about who's setting the prices, then that would fall directly to the end user. So I mean, if you're a cow-calf producer, the one driving the prices is the feeder that's bidding on them. The feeder's prices are derived from what they get from the packer. The packer's prices, we'd like to hope and think, are derived from the consumer and what they're willing to pay for beef. And that's where we found a major impasse. We have finally created this system that has our product selling so good. And in an event as COVID, and through that crisis, when people turned to what they knew and they knew the best and bought all this beef product up and bought it so well, and that these prices on the retail level shot through the roof, the prices that the feeders received went down almost in reverse the same. And then, of course, then the prices that they paid the cow-calf producers in your state and all the other cow-calf producers went down. So there is a part in the system where it hasn't worked. And when we talk about supply and demand, and I hear that all the time, the problem with the supply and demand issue is if too many of these cattle are forward contracted, and then we don't have an open competitive cash market, it probably sets an artificial floor at where the cash price is, and probably sends dynamics down the system that really aren't truthful to the market.
Thank you, Mr. Schaben. Appreciate that. Mr. Slover, there have been recent widely covered events that have had a huge impact on the market for beef. The Tyson plant fire in 2019, the recent ransomware attack targeting JBS. When we have this kind of consolidation in the packing sector, what does that mean in terms of the impact on the market of these events that can have a huge impact at one facility or for one company?
It makes the supply chain more vulnerable to these disruptions, and it points out starkly that the marketplace and competition means more than just dry economic efficiency. It's a matter of severe consequences, potentially life and death. And I would also like to say, in reference to your previous questions, that it's the concentration in the middle of the supply chain, all of those points of starting with the packers and ending with the retailers, that's got the producers on one side and the consumers on the other suffering. They're bearing the brunt of the choke points along the rest of the chain. And it's just a question of how those choke points are interacting with each other. But the signals for demand at the consumer side are not making their way through to the producers at the supply side without interference by those choke points.
Thank you, Mr. Slover. Appreciate that. And certainly my office is hearing from cattle producers in Georgia about the impact that concentration in the packing sector has on them. I want to thank you again, Ranking Member Grassley, for convening this hearing, Chair Durbin and Chair Klobuchar, and appreciate our panel's attendance, and I yield.
Also, Ranking Member Lee, we thank him. And I will note, Senator Ossoff, you had the best lighting of any of our guests so far remotely.
Regards to Ranking Member Lee as well, appreciate it, and thank you, Senator Klobuchar.
That really should come with a prize.
With the green, with the look, it was really,
it was
actually
good. Very well
good.
done.
Very well done. Okay, Senator Lee's second round, I guess.
Mr. Larue, we've heard from the meat packers that they're already required by law to report, I think, twice each day to the U.S. Department of Agriculture the price they pay for all cattle and the price at which they sell. Is that right?
Yes.
And if that's the case, why is that reporting not enough to ensure adequate price discovery?
Most of what is actually reported does not show a true cash, or because cash is now such a small part of what it ends up being reported, we don't have a true capture of where that market lies. Because we have such a large amount of that now captured by the AMAs, this actually has a loop effect. Not only does it have a effect of driving that cash price down, but then that gets built in to the AMAs, because that's typically used as the base price, which then further erodes that cycle. I would, if it would be okay, I would just draw to the committee's attention. Earlier, there was a reference to a report from 2008 that talked about the benefits of an AMA from USDA and their Packers and Stockyards program. There's a 2014 report which describes this process that we are now seeing with the increase of AMAs and the lack of transparency in those, the effect that that has on the cash price, and then that loop and eroding effect.
So are there changes that could be made to the mandatory reporting requirements that would be more helpful, that would make it more helpful?
Yeah, first of all, I do believe that we need to make sure that we are increasing the amount of cash or spot market negotiations. I think that on top of that, bringing some light and transparency to the terms of these marketing agreements through a contract library would be very helpful.
Mr. Schulpepper, these AMAs and contract cattle are said to encourage better quality animals and bring efficiencies into the system. And of course, the government can't be in the business of mandating against efficiencies and quality. That being the case, all producers and feeders could probably make better business decisions if they had a reliable base price. So can you tell me about what percentage of the cattle that JBS produces each week, what percentage comes from the cash market as opposed to cattle that come to you under contractual obligations?
Thank you, Senator. I don't have that particular piece of information in front of me on what that percentage is. But I think it's important to note that when we talk about AMA, that this has been a producer decision as well.
But wait, why wouldn't you know that? I'm confused as to why you wouldn't know that information.
I don't have that information in front of me, Senator. I can certainly get back with you or your office with that information.
Okay. You have a rough approximate guess?
Senator, I would like to note that we are very active in the cash market. We're in the cash market every day. We're in numerous sale barns every day. We are also a very active participant in video markets. So we are very much a supporter of the cash market, and we are an active participant. We have both AMAs and active participation in the cash market.
Okay. Mr. Miller, what about you? What percentage of the cattle Tyson purchases each week come from the cash market as opposed to cattle coming through contractual obligations? Did we lose you, Mr. Miller?
Oh, Senator Lee, hold on. Mr. Miller?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Not sure what happened there. All right, sorry about that. Senator, thank you for the question. What I was saying was that, the competitiveness of this marketplace, obviously with a competitor in this hearing, in this call, I don't really want to divulge my specifics, but I will say this, from a formula-based AMA perspective, over 50% of the cattle that we do purchase are under an AMA. The other piece of this too, that we're leaving out another component that's in the negotiated trade, or a component, I'll say it's a byproduct of the negotiated trade, is our forward contracts. So we do contract with specific producers because they want to have a risk management program in place to allow them to minimize their risk, but also from a banking perspective too, that if they're able to lock in a specific price on a forward contract, they can go back to their bank and say, look, I have my cattle sold off in the futures market at X. So there's some other components to this too, hence the reason I don't want to give you specifics, but we can certainly follow back up with you, Senator.
In your opinion, would better price discovery and transparency benefit the producers and feeders who are left out of the AMAs and other contract pricing?
Well, I think one thing, AMAs do not lock out any supplier to selling to Tyson. We'll put together an AMA with anyone. So I think that the negativity that's being cast on the AMAs is not accurate. They do give producers a forward look of what the value of their cattle are going to bring, but they do not lock them. We don't say, if you're a smaller producer and you only bring 100 head, we're not going to put you on an AMA. That's not true.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Do you have anything else, Senator Grassley? Follow up? Okay. I just had one or two very.
There is one thing.
Oh, of course. Yes. Okay. And you see.
To add to the record a letter from RCAF USA.
Okay. So be added. Just quickly, Mr. Larue, Secretary of Vilsack, I know he was recently in your state, Mr. Schaben, in talking about his home state, some of the things the USDA can do that are contained in the President's executive order on competition. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I appreciate it. We are excited and hopeful that the President's executive order will provide some movement forward in this space. First of all, the Packers and Stockyards Act that's been mentioned a few times today is celebrating its 100th birthday in just a matter of days, and yet has really kind of been eroded in terms of enforcement and really good, fair protections for family farmers and ranchers. And so USDA has signaled that they will begin rulemaking to address some key challenges within the Packers and Stockyards Act and to provide protections for growers out there. We see major problems in contract growers of poultry. We see challenges within the hog industry and certainly within the beef industry as well. And so bringing greater clarity for what are unfair practices, bringing greater certainty for protections, including protections against retaliation against some of these players. They also, in that executive order, have clarified that they will be looking at labels such as Product of the USA, which right now in meat products can be used even if it contains foreign meat, as long as those products has been partially modified. Once they are imported, they are able to use the Product of the USA label. We certainly feel, and I think most family farmers and ranchers believe, that this is not only anti-competitive, but from the consumer's point of view, is an egregious failure to provide truthfulness in labeling. So we're encouraged by these actions and certainly would encourage additional action to bring competition to this marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Smith, back there, we haven't heard from you a little bit. Just sort of the same type of question, not on rulemaking necessarily, but just what you see as a solution for some of the grosser issues you raised.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, certainly, I'm a grocer, but all we're asking for is a level playing field. Robinson-Patman, we thought, should ensure that we get fair terms and fair prices for the same product. But what we're dealing with is that it's gone unenforced, and we really see nothing that is stopping the continued increase of market power by those power buyers. So it's the same thing. It's transparency and fairness and an equal opportunity. That's all we're asking for.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And maybe we end with Mr. Slover, because you mentioned my bill a few times, as well as Senator Grassley and Senator Lee's bill. Just the idea as we look at targeted approaches from the meatpacking discussions we've had today to pharma, where there's bipartisan work being done there and has been done, especially with the two people right here sitting with me, and also on tech. But at the same time, if we want to get at some of this consolidation overall, the virtue of doing at least some changes that would help us with consolidation in general to make it easier to bring these cases, because I view this as pro-competition, going way back to Adam Smith, who always warned about, as he talked about the invisible hand and the importance of capitalism, he literally from the beginning of our country warned about the unbridled army of monopolies and what could happen if we let that go. Could you just talk briefly about the importance of making some changes that would be more comprehensive to make it easier to bring some of these cases, not just to in the food industry or grocers as just discussed, but in general?
Yes, thank you, Senator. So two things that I highlighted in my written statement that are in your bill. One of them would strengthen merger enforcement by focusing on the largest mergers and creating presumptions that have been recognized in the courts before but aren't recognized as often as they should be, to have the merging parties justify that their mergers are not going to cause harm. The other one that I highlighted in my testimony is strengthening the laws against abuse by dominant corporations, closing off competition by sabotaging essentially the competitive efforts of their rivals and making that be able to reach more clearly to all of the dominant firms that have that power. And then very briefly, I would just like to piggyback on what Mr. Larue said, that we are all in favor of country of origin labeling. Consumers want to know where their food is coming from as well. Thank you.
Okay, very good. And I just think to my colleagues, as we forge ahead here and look at some of these specific industries, we also should try to find common ground on some of these changes we can make in general to the laws, because then it's going to be another industry, and then it's going to be online travel, and then it's going to be something else. Because I think if we get the resources to the agencies, shift the burden in these biggest cases, and make some changes that I truly don't think will be radical and will help the vast majority of businesses. It's going to take some leap of faith, because everyone's going to have a business that won't like it. But then when you really push it, I think they're going to tell you that they can survive in a competitive market. So I think that is our challenge and our burden as we go forward here. But this has been a fantastic hearing. Thank you for staying to the end, Senator Cotton. You get the prize. Also, just thank you to Senator Grassley, Senator Durbin, Senator Lee, and really everyone that took part in this. I hope you saw the best of spirited discussion, some different views, but also some commonalities. And that's what we're really trying to carve out here in this area of competition, so we can find some areas where we can work together. So thank you all. We're going to keep the record open for this hearing for a week. Until August 5th, 2021. So we welcome further questions, comments, or anything you want to say. With that, I'm going to have to reach over to adjourn the hearing. The hearing's adjourned.